The city is in flames, the temple is desecrated, the streets covered in bodies, and cries of despair echo through the rubble. Amidst the chaos, a man kneels on the earth, blackened by destruction. His face is marked by sorrow, his robes torn from the journey, and his voice is a lament against the very heavens. How long? Lord, he is neither a king nor a warrior, but his words carry the weight of a fate he cannot change. God has given him a terrifying vision, the ruin of his people, the rise of a ruthless empire, and a divine silence. That seems more cruel than any sword, but there is something more, something Habakkuk has yet to understand. If God is just, why does he allow the wicked to prosper? How can he use an even more cruel people to punish Judah? And in the end, when the dust settles and the ashes cool, where will God's answer be? Prepared to dive into the journey of a prophet who dared to question the Almighty and discovered a truth that would change everything. Follow this story and see how even in silence God still speaks. Join us as we explore how the prophet Habakkuk faced doubt, injustice, and God's silence, becoming a symbol of unwavering faith and hope amidst the destruction of Judah. The biting breeze of Judah blew through the hills, bringing with it the dust and the scent of dry earth that filled the air. The sky was heavy, as though the very heavens were trying to hide the sun, perhaps ashamed of what was happening below. Judah, a nation that once flourished under God's promises, now seemed on the brink of succumbing to its own decay. The light of hope seemed to have extinguished, and in its place, emptiness reigned. Habakkuk walked through the narrow streets of his village, which no longer had the vibrant energy it once did. The houses, now silent, had their doors locked, their inhabitants fearing the fury of the approaching Babylonians. The sound of children's laughter had disappeared, replaced by the heavy silence of a city on the edge of collapse. Even the market, once overflowing with the exchange of goods and stories, was empty. Its stalls overturned, baskets broken, products looted. What once was a center of life was now just a distant echo of past times. He watched the hungry children, their large empty eyes dragging themselves through the streets, the dear dirty hands touching the few scraps of food that remained. The women, especially the widows, seemed the most defeated. They walked with their heads down, their tired eyes carrying the weight of unimaginable suffering. The burden of sadness, hunger, and the fear of impending invasions seemed to crush the packs of all. But the worst of all was what he saw in the eyes of the men who were supposed to be the protectors, the judges, priests, and rulers, who had once sworn to serve the Lord with justice, were now the cruelest of dictators for the price of a coin. The priests ignored God's laws for a bit of silver, and the rulers, corrupted by power, betrayed their own people in secret negotiations with the Babylonian Empire. Habakkuk stopped in front of the central square. What had once been a meeting and trade in place now looked like an abandoned battlefield. The marks of a recent fire were on the stones, and the smell of burnt wood still lingered in the air. The temple of God, which had once been the center of worship, was damaged. The stone columns were broken, and the inscriptions on the walls had been partially erased. The place of prayer and holiness was now empty, like an abandoned skeleton. The prophet sat on a stone, gazing at the scene of destruction and pain. The people of Judah, the nation God had chosen, were now on the brink of collapse, and he, as a prophet, felt powerless. He had always had faith, he had always believed in God's promises, but now, seeing all that suffering, he could no longer simply ignore the questions that formed in his mind. He looked up at the sky, the darkness beginning to swallow the horizon. Those stars that had once inspired him now seemed to mock him, blinking as though they were too distant to hear his prayers. He felt the weight of injustice upon his shoulders, and God's silence, as deep as the abyss, tormented him. What more could he do? How could he continue to trust in a God who seemed so distant when his people needed him most? With a heavy sigh, Habakkuk rose. The night was approaching, and he could no longer bear to stay in that place. The weight of doubt was consuming him, but he needed to find an answer. He began walking toward a distant hill, where an ancient olive tree still stood against the sky. There he knelt, his knees touching the cold earth. It was as if the earth itself was suffering with him. Habakkuk looked at the sky once more, seeking some answer. Any answer. He felt that his soul was filled with questions that he no longer knew how to answer. He had been called by God to be a prophet, but what was he supposed to say to the people now? How could he speak of hope and justice when everything around him seemed so dark? O Lord, how long must I cry for help, and you will not listen? How long must I see injustice triumph and the wicked oppress the righteous? His voice rang out strong in the stillness of the night, laden with pain and frustration. The words came out like a desperate cry, an attempt to relieve the crushing weight of his mind. Why, he wondered, why have you remained silent? The wind blowing through the hills seemed to answer bitterly, not with words but with a whisper. Habakkuk closed his eyes and waited, but there was no answer, only the sound of the wind. He waited for a moment, but nothing came. The silence stretched out like a heavy shadow over him. Habakkuk looked at the olive tree, its roots strong and deep like a symbol of resilience. He remembered the days when his faith seemed simple, when he believed that divine justice would be immediate, but those days seemed so distant now. The words he had heard from his parents, the teachings of the ancient prophets, all of that now seemed like distant echoes. What he feared most was becoming real. Perhaps God was silent, perhaps he had turned away. Lord, why do you allow evil to prosper? Why does the righteous suffer while the wicked advance? Once again silence fell upon him, deeper than the darkness of the night. The loneliness was overwhelming, but then something stirred within him. He knew his mission was not to give up. He had to cry out. He had to keep seeking even without understanding. Faith was never about understanding. It was about trust, and he knew that was still possible. Habakkuk rose, his voice a bit stronger now. He still did not know why the Lord was silent, but something told him that this was part of the divine plan. He did not have all the answers, but his mission was to help his people understand that even in silence, God was still present, still in control. But was God truly listening, or was there something darker behind this silence? Something that Habakkuk could never imagine. The night in Judah was heavy, suffocating. The wind blew between the hills, carrying with it the dust of the desert and the laments of a forgotten people. Habakkuk stood on the hill, his eyes fixed on the dark horizon. The silence of God still echoed within him, pressing against his chest like invisible chains, but he would not give up. He could not. With a deep sigh, he knelt once again. The cold earth beneath his knees contrasted with the heat of his indignation. He clenched his fists against his chest, closed his eyes, and cried out, Lord, how long will you allow justice to be corrupted? How long will the powerful crush the weak without your hand stopping them? The wind seemed too quiet for a moment, as if the world itself was waiting for an answer. Habakkuk kept his eyes closed, his heart beating fast. Then something changed. A presence filled the air around him. There was no sound of thunder nor a glorious vision of angels descending from the heavens, but the prophet felt as if it was something more real than the very earth beneath his feet, that God was there. And then the answer came. Behold, I am raising up the Babylonians, a cruel and pitiless people, to judge the iniquity of Judah. The words tore through the silence like a sharp blade. Habakkuk suddenly opened his eyes, his whole body trembling. He felt his stomach turn. He had cried for justice, but he never expected to hear this. No, his voice faltered as if the air had been ripped from his lungs. The Babylonians, how can this be? They are worse than we are. They destroy nations without mercy, devour everything in their path. How can you use them, Lord? Where is the justice in that? God continued, his voice serene and unyielding like the flow of a river that cannot be interrupted. They will march across the land like a burning wind. They will take cities, subjugate kings. They recognize no God but their own strength. Their horses are faster than leopards. Their warriors are like hungry wolves at dusk. Habakkuk's heart pounded against his chest as if wanting to flee from what he had just heard. He closed his eyes, his mind spinning. How could God allow this? He had always known Judah was corrupted, but Babylon was pure evil. They burned cities to ashes, enslaved entire peoples, turned men into shadows and children into prisoners. Lord, this cannot be. You are pure, holy. How can you look upon their cruelty and allow them to prosper? How can you let them use their sword against us, your people? But God did not retract his words. The plan was already in motion. The judgment had been decreed. Habakkuk felt weak. His legs buckled, and he fell sitting on the dry earth. He had asked for justice. He had cried for God to intervene, but this was the answer. The vision began to form in his mind. He saw Babylonian soldiers marching there, banners fluttering like shadows in the wind. He saw the walls of Judah being torn down, the screams of women and children echoing between the burning houses. He saw the sacred temple being looted, the priests being taken in chains like animals. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to push away the images. This couldn't be real. This couldn't happen, but it was already happening. The prophet breathed deeply, trying to organize his thoughts. Maybe there was something he didn't understand. Maybe God wanted him to see something beyond the destruction, something he couldn't yet comprehend. He stood up, his knees trembling. If this was God's answer, then he needed to know more. He needed to understand why justice would come in such a cruel manner. The sun began to rise on the horizon, painting the sky with a deep red. The day was dawning, but for Habakkuk it felt as if an eternal night had begun. What would Habakkuk do now that he knew the judgment would come not by the hand of a savior but by the sword of a merciless enemy? Before continuing, we kindly ask for your support. Please subscribe to the channel and like the video to bless us and help spread these Bible stories. Now let's continue with Habakkuk's journey and his quest for answers in the face of divine judgment. Habakkuk descended from the hill with the weight of the world on his shoulders. God's response still echoed in his mind like a distant, insistent, and unrelenting thunder. Babylon. How could God use a people even more wicked to punish Judah? The prophet felt himself sinking into an endless abyss. He had cried out for justice, and in return he had received a sentence of destruction. He walked through the streets of the city, feeling the dust stick to his skin mixed with the cold sweat that ran down his forehead. The morning silence was deceiving. People began to leave their homes unaware of what was about to happen. Women carried empty baskets, hoping to find something in the looted markets. Tired folkmen gathered to discuss the ever-increasing taxes levied by the rulers. Children played, not knowing that their laughter would soon be replaced by screams of terror. Habakkuk knew he needed to speak. He needed to warn them, but who would listen? Taking a deep breath, he headed toward the royal palace. The place, guarded by armed soldiers, was a symbol of Judah's decadence. Inside, amid luxurious tapestries and abundant tables, the leaders feasted as if nothing was wrong. The king, in heavy robes with a bored expression, drank wine while listening to flattery from the priests and corrupt advisors. The prophet passed through the gates and entered without hesitation. The guards hesitated for a moment, but no one dared to stop him. His fiery gaze and determined posture were more intimidating than any weapon. The hall fell silent as Habakkuk stood before the king. Majesty, I have heard the word of the Lord, and I come with a warning. Judah is condemned. God will bring judgment upon us. Through Babylon they will come like a merciless wind, destroy our houses, burn our crops, and take our people captive. Nothing will remain, for the corruption of our rulers has reached the heavens, and the Lord will not delay. Enacting, the king placed his cup on the table and let out a short laugh. He cast a bored glance at the priest beside him, who muttered to each other, annoyed by the interruption. "Another prophet of doom," said the king, wiping his lips with the sleeve of his tunic. "How many times have we heard these words, and yet we are still here? Judah still stands. There will always be threats, but our God is with us. After all, didn't he choose us? Didn't he promise us this land?" Habakkuk felt his blood boil. How could they be so blind? "Our God does not take pleasure in corruption. He does not ignore the suffering of the orphan and the widow," retorted the prophet, stepping forward. "You fill yourselves with riches, while the people starve. You sell justice for silver. Worship God with your lips while your hearts belong to gold. Do you think he will ignore this?" The hall erupted in murmurs. Some priests nervously looked at one another. The advisors exchanged disdainful glances, but it was the king who raised his hand, silencing the room. His eyes narrowed as he stared at Habakkuk. "You speak of judgment, prophet, but where is your proof? Have you seen the Babylonian army? Have you seen their spears at the city gates? Or are these just words in the wind? I did not choose Babylon. God did. He has already decreed it, and his word never fails." Habakkuk replied. The king laughed again, but this time there was something dark in his laughter. "If this is the fate of Judah, then there is nothing we can do. But until Babylon arrives, we will continue living as we always have, and you, prophet, would do well to watch your words. The people are tired of doomsayers and prophets of destruction. Be careful." There was a threat in his voice. The prophet knew he had said enough. Without another word, he turned and left the palace, feeling the heavy stares on his back. Outside, he felt his chest tighten. He had expected resistance, but seeing the mock God's warning made him feel even more alone. As he walked through the city, he began to hear the whispers. People pointed in his direction. Some called him mad. Others spat on the ground as he passed. Someone threw a stone which narrowly grazed his leg. "Stop spreading fear, prophet," shouted a man, his eyes full of rage. "Are you trying to make us give up our homes, our city?" Another added. Habakkuk clenched his fists, but did not respond. They didn't want to listen. They preferred to believe in the illusion of security rather than face the truth. But then a quiet, hesitant voice spoke out from the crowd. "What if he's right?" An uncomfortable silence spread. Some people lowered their heads, uneasy even without admitting it. Many feared what the prophet was saying. They saw the injustices, felt the weight of the excessive taxes, knew the corruption of the rulers. Deep down, perhaps they knew that judgment was coming. Habakkuk didn't need to say anything more. He just continued on his way. When he reached his house, he fell to his knees. The exhaustion weighed on him, not just in his body but in his soul. Would no one ever listen? He closed his eyes and sighed. "Lord, I spoke what you commanded, but who listened to me? Who understood?" Silence was his only answer. If no one listened, what more could Habakkuk do? How could he continue being a prophet if his voice was ignored? Chapter 4. The arrival of the invaders. The wind blew hot that morning, a dry wind carrying sand and omens. Habakkuk felt a shiver run down his spine when he saw the first signs of smoke on the horizon, small dark streaks against the pale sky growing every hour. It wasn't hard to know what that meant. The neighboring cities were falling. The prophet tightened his cloak around his body and walked to the top of the hill. From there he could see far, and what he saw made his stomach churn. It wasn't just smoke, it was columns of dust rising in the distance, stirred up by marching armies. The Babylonians were coming. Rumors had already started to spread throughout the city. First came the terrified travelers, merchants, who had barely escaped. They spoke of destroyed walls, streets engulfed in fire screams cutting through the night. They spoke of soldiers with no mercy, of men dragged in chains and women separated from their children. At first people didn't want to believe it, but now as the sky turned sickly red at sunset and the news of destruction drew ever closer, fear began to infiltrate the streets of Judah. Habakkuk walked through the city and saw the panic in the people's eyes. Women whispered among themselves, their faces covered with veils, their hands restless. Men clenched their fists, debating whether it was better to flee or to fight. Children clung to their mothers' garments, asking what was happening, but no one had answers, and the leaders, the prophet, knew where to find them. The king and his advisor were at the palace, surrounded by guards, hidden behind high walls and closed doors. They still clung to the illusion that nothing would happen. After all, Judah had always been spared. Jerusalem had never fallen. They trusted their stone walls more than they trusted God's. Warning, Habakkuk approached the palace gates. The guards watched him with suspicious eyes, but didn't stop him. Perhaps they feared he brought more bad news inside the hall. The atmosphere was tense. The king sat on his throne, a goblet of wine in his hand, but his fingers trembled. The advisors spoke in low voices, trying to stay calm. A general pointed to a map on the table, his voice laden with impatience. "They can't get here that fast. We still have time to prepare. If we close the gates and reinforce the walls, we'll resist." Habakkuk spoke, his voice echoing through the hall. "Don't you understand yet? There is no resistance against God's judgment. It's not the walls that will save you." The men turned to face him. The king sighed heavily and placed the goblet on the arm of his throne. "You again, prophet? Isn't it enough to bring desire?" "I don't bring desire. I don't bring disaster, your majesty. I only speak the truth that you refuse to see. The Babylonians are already here. They come like a mighty wind, sweeping everything, and there will be no mercy." This general snorted. "The Lord will protect us as he always has. Jerusalem is sacred. The temple still stands. God will not let us fall. You think you can use the Lord's name as a shield when for years you've despised his Justice, Habakkuk retorted, stepping forward. He does not protect the corrupt. He is not pleased with those who rule with hands stained in blood. The judgment is coming soon. The whole fell into silence. The king stood up, crossing his arms. His gaze was filled with fury and fear. Enough, I will not listen to your dark words anymore. Let the Babylonians come. We will fight until the end. Habakkuk shook his head. There was nothing more to say. He turned and left the palace, feeling an overwhelming weight on his shoulders. Outside, the city was changing. He saw groups of men sharpening swords, preparing spears, but there were also those gathering their belongings, ready to flee. Fear was turning into music. Despair. That night the sky seemed darker than ever. The prophet climbed the hill once more and looked toward the road leading to the lands of Judah. Then he saw them. Lanterns danced on the horizon, small lights moving in the darkness, but they weren't stars, they were torches. Many of the Babylonians were closer than anyone had imagined. Would it be too late for Judah to repent, or was the judgment already sealed? The first arrow cut through the sky like a harbinger of doom, a single line of fire crossing the night before embedding itself in one of the towers of the walls of Judah. The impact was followed by a heavy silence, as if even the wind was holding its breath. But then came the others. Thousands of flaming arrows streaked across the sky, raining down on the city as if the heavens themselves were pouring their fury upon the people. The crackling of fire mixed with screams, desperate prayers, and the sound of war trumpets. Ok watched from the hill, his heart tight, feeling his body shudder with the force of the destruction. He knew this was coming. He had foretold the judgment, but nothing could have prepared him for what he saw now. It was worse than any vision, worse than any nightmare. The walls of Judah trembled with the impact of the Babylonian battering rams. The gates were struck relentlessly, each blow a death sentence for those on the other side. The soldiers of Judah tried to resist, but they were few, poorly prepared, and overwhelmed by fear. The faith that had once sustained them had dissipated with the first wave of despair inside the city. Chaos reigned. Men ran to save their families. Women grabbed their children and hid wherever they could. The elderly, too weak to flee, simply sat at their doorways, awaiting the inevitable. Habakkuk clenched his fists. Lord, where are you? His voice was a whisper, heavy with disbelief. He knew God had allowed this. He knew Judah's corruption demanded judgment, but where was the mercy he saw when the gates gave way? A thunderous roar shook the earth as wood and iron crumbled, opening the way for the tide of Babylonian warriors, who surged into the city like a raging river. The prophet ran down the hill, his heart pounding against his chest. He needed to see, he needed to understand. As he crossed the streets, he smelled the acrid scent of smoke and burnt flesh. He saw fallen bodies, people crushed under the debris of their own homes. He heard the screams of women being dragged away and the muffled cries of children who didn't understand what was happening. He tried to cover his ears, but the sounds of destruction were relentless. The temple, Habakkuk ran to it, but when he arrived, he felt a lump in his throat. The holy place, the house of the Most High God, was desecrated. Babylonian soldiers were tearing apart the sacred artifacts, laughing as they destroyed the altars. Gold and silver were plundered as if they were mere war trophies. The high priest lay on the ground, his robe stained with blood, his eyes still wide in shock. Other priests were being dragged away as prisoners, their beards brutally pulled by soldiers who mocked them. Habakkuk fell to his knees. He wanted to pray, but the words wouldn't come. Was God really in control? The king of Judah tried to flee, but was captured. He was brought before the Babylonian commander, who looked at him with disdain. The prophet couldn't look away as the man was forced to kneel. The leader of the invaders didn't hesitate. With a single gesture, he sealed the king's fate before the people. Blood splattered onto the cold stones of the palace. Injustice seemed to triumph. Evil was winning. Habakkuk squeezed his eyes shut, trying to push away the pain that burned in his soul. Everything he believed in, everything he had thought for, seemed to have been reduced to ashes before him. If God was in control, why was he allowing such destruction? Where was his justice? The horizon burned in shades of orange and red as the flames of Judah grew like tongues of fire, consuming everything in their path. The walls, once symbols of strength and protection, now bowed before the relentless force of the Babylonian Aeon. The city lay in ruins, its inhabitants dragged into the abyss of destruction. There was no more safety, no refuge, no hope, only the echo of screams, the sound of blades, and the resounding crash of battering rams tearing down the city gates. Habakkuk watched from the hill, his body heavy and his heart tight. He could smell death in the air, the stench of burnt flesh mixed with the dust of despair. Every spark in the air seemed a cruel reminder of the judgment he had prophesied, but seeing it all unfold before his eyes was as if his own soul was being destroyed along with his city. How could he have imagined the pain would be so deep, so overwhelming? The prophet, still silent, found himself powerless before the chaos he had warned of what was to come. He knew that Judah's sin demanded judgment, but no one was prepared for the fury that was descending upon the land. The land itself seemed to be bleeding, trees burned, fountains ran dry, and even the wind seemed to carry in its currents the muffled cry of a dying nation on every corner. Destruction unfolded like a page ripped from a holy book, and the faces of the citizens, once full of hope, were now marked by pain and resignation. Entire families were torn from their homes, pushed away from what they had once called home. The streets that had been alive with trade feasts and celebrations were now immersed in the somber silence of death. The city seemed to have lost its soul. Habakkuk descended quickly from the hill. His steps were fast but heavy. He wanted to see with his own eyes. understand what was happening, but he knew what he would find would be hard to bear. And as he entered the city, the weight of destruction hit him with brutal force. The ground was covered with bodies, some still trying to resist, others already lifeless, but all with eyes turned to the void as if waiting for a miracle that would not come. He walked through the city, passing by ruined houses, looted shops, and profaned churches. The temple, the one that symbolized God's presence in Judah, was now completely destroyed. The altar where the priests had offered sacrifices to God was covered in blood. The sacred artifacts, the objects that had once been treated with such respect, were being plundered by the invaders. Gold, silver, and sacred candles were all being reduced to war trophies. The high priest, a man who had dedicated his life to prayer and worship, lay on the ground, his robe stained with blood. His death was swift, without honor, without mercy. Habakkuk felt stunned. He looked around, but nothing made sense. Everything he had believed, everything he had preached, now seemed like a cruel game with no purpose. He fell to his knees before the destroyed altar. The words of pleading that had once flowed easily from his lips now seemed frozen in his throat. He no longer knew how to pray nor what to ask. God seemed distant, unreachable. Where was the promise of redemption? Where was the justice? Lord, he whispered, his voice hurrah and filled with doubt, where are you now? Why have you abandoned us? Judah's corruption has led us to the abyss, but what of your power and your mercy? He lifted his eyes to the sky, hoping for some response, some confirmation that there was still hope, but all he found was emptiness, silence. The sound of the Babylonians dragging the prisoners echoed in the distance, men, women, children, all being led like cattle to the unknown. Hur saw them, their eyes empty of fear, their bodies exhausted. He wanted to run to them, shout, free them, but he knew any attempt would be futile. They were lost, just like him, lost in the darkness that consumed Judah. And then the king of Judah was brought before him, dragged by the Babylonians. Soldiers, the man who had ruled with such pride, was now on his knees before his enemies. The Babylonian commander looked at him with disdain, and in a swift gesture had the king executed right there before the people. Before Habakkuk, blood gushed, staining the ground with the color of defeat. The prophet could not look away. Injustice was sealing its victory. Evil was triumphing. Lord, he murmured again, but this time his voice faltered. Lord, where is your justice? He slowly stood up, his eyes fixed on the shadows stretching before him, the shadows of doubt and hopelessness. And it was then that, amidst all that destruction, he felt a presence. Something was about to happen. Something more, something worse. He didn't know what, but a sense that everything was about to become even darker enveloped him. He tried to move away, but his feet wouldn't budge. Something was waiting. Something he could not foresee. Something that would change everything. But what? As Habakkuk looked toward the dark future, a cold sensation ran down his spine. God's judgment was not over. What more could happen in a land already lost? The city of Judah, once pulsating with life and faith, now lay disfigured like a lifeless corpse. The streets covered in ashes and blood bore witness to the destruction, while the heavens, seemingly ashamed, remained closed, offering no response, no comfort. Chaos, a constant shadow, hung over everyone, and amid all this something more insidious emerged, a pain deeper than any Babylonian sword. Betrayal. Habakkuk walked among the city's ruins, his steps heavy, his eyes tired, but his mind alert to an evil not visible on the battlefields or in the palace halls. It was no longer the Babylonian Empire, but something far closer, something that hid among those he had once considered brothers, fellow believers, and comrades in struggle. He had seen the flame of destruction, heard the cries of pain, but what he was about to discover on his journey through the heart of the city would be darker than any invasion. In one of the most desolate streets, where houses had been looted and doors broken down, Habakkuk came upon a group of men, some of whom he recognized. Jews. Their faces, once marked by purity and faith, were now filled with scar of corruption and betrayal. They spoke in hushed tones, nervous eyes constantly darting to the sides as if they feared being seen, but the prophet saw them, and there was no denying what was happening. They were collaborating with Babylon, these men who once proclaimed God's word as their own thought. Habakkuk now bowed before the enemy as if honor and faith were disposable. They seek the gold, the silver, and the power offered by the Babylonians, without realizing they are selling their souls. The prophet approached, and his presence was immediately noticed. The men fell silent, their eyes avoiding Habakkuk's fixed gaze. He felt a growing rage within him. How could they do this? How could they betray their own nation, their own brothers, to secure a life of fleeting wealth? How could they sell their loyalty to God's people for a handful of coins? The anguish in his chest nearly suffocated him. You sold yourselves to the enemy, Habakkuk asked, his voice tense with a pain he could hardly control. Where is the honor of Judah? Where is the faithfulness to the covenant we made with God? Do you not see that you are digging the grave of our people? The men fell silent, some avoiding eye contact with the prophet, others clearly uncomfortable, but all aware of the gravity of the accusation. But one of them, a man with a thick beard and a hardened expression, stepped forward. Habakkuk, you are blind man of God, he said with disdain. Do you still believe salvation will come? What is left of our nation? What is left of our faith? What do we have left but survival? The Babylonians are strong, and we must accept reality. Salvation will not come with empty prayers or words of condemnation. It will come with power, with wealth, with protection. The prophet looked at him with a mixture of anger, And sadness, how had these men been able to sacrifice everything for a future that was not theirs? They were accepting the power of Babylon not out of conviction but out of fear. Fear of death, fear of destruction, and deep down they knew that the real destruction did not come only from the outside but from within. Their betrayal was the sharpest blade. You chose the path of corruption, Habakkuk replied, his voice firm, and in the end no gold or silver will save your soul when the Babylonians tire of using you when you are no longer useful. What will be left of you? What will be left of Judah? Before the men could react, Habakkuk turned and began walking away. He felt the pain in his chest grow, but the worst was yet to come. The eyes watching him with distrust were now burning with anger. He knew his actions had made him a target, but he could not remain silent. The betrayal needed to be exposed. As he walked away, the man with the thick beard signaled, and in a swift motion other men approached her. Habakkuk did not see the daggers until it was too late. The first strike was quick, slicing through his right arm. He screamed, but tried to defend himself, his mind dazed by the pain. They were not just traitors, they were cruel. The men, enraged by the accusation of corruption, wanted to silence the prophet before he could react. A blade struck his chest, blood gushed hot and thick, and the prophet fell to his knees, struggling to breathe, his vision blurred. But he tried to keep his eyes open as if wanting to absorb that moment until the end. The betrayal he faced was not just from the Babylonians but from his own brothers. They had traded their faith and honor for gold, and now he was paying the price for trying to awaken their consciences. As darkness took over his senses, Habakkuk still heard the murmurs of the traitors moving away like rats. Slinking into the night, he could barely stay conscious, but one last word rose in his mind, a word of faith. Lord, he whispered with a little strength left, where is your justice? But at that moment God's response did not come. The prophet collapsed, and the last trace of his faith was lost in the blood and abandonment. As Habakkuk fell to the ground, his last strength draining away, he felt a presence. He didn't know what it was, but something told him that his fate had not yet been sealed. Something was still to come, something greater, something darker, and he knew deep down that he had not yet completed his mission. The desert stretched out before Habakkuk, an expanse of sand and silence. It was a sea of solitude where the scorching heat of the sun burned his skin and the dry breeze seemed to carry away all hope. The blood from his wounds no longer flowed, but the weight of pain, betrayal, and abandonment still pursued him. Each step in the desert was a reflection of his inner struggle, a reflection of the search for something that no longer seemed to be there. He had been left to die, and in some way his soul seemed to have followed the same path. Habakkuk dragged himself forward, his feet burning with each step on the hot sand, but he did not stop. He had no more place to go, nothing left to bind him to the city, to the people who had betrayed him, to those words of condemnation that now seemed empty. The prophet had moved away from pain, from destruction, but he felt as though he had plunged into something even deeper, a darkness from which there was no escape. Every thought was an agony, every memory a gaping wound in his soul. The vision of the ruined city, the smell of blood, the voices of betrayal still echoed in his mind. Music. God, where are you? He murmured to himself, his voice hoarse and weak. The echo of his words was lost in the wind, as if the desert itself was swallowing him whole. There was no answer. He felt lost more than ever. God, who once spoke so clearly and powerfully in his heart, now seemed a distant presence, a sigh in the wind. The prophet was without answer, without direction, wandering in a world that no longer made sense. He sat down on the sand, his body exhausted, his mind still working, but faith seemed to have already slipped away. He had preached God's word, he had warned, he had suffered for the choices of his people, and in the end all that remained was destruction, death, and betrayal. The people of Judah whom he loved were being consumed by Babylon, and those who could have done something, those who could have resisted, were now collaborating with the enemies. The king himself, a shadow of the man he had been, was already dead, and there was no one left to lead. There was something so cruel and unjust in the fact that until the end, Judah seemed to be surrendering to a fate it did not choose. But more than that, there was the bitter feeling that Habakkuk had failed to make a difference. He had failed. Lord, why didn't you hear my prayers? Why didn't you come to our aid? The words escaped his mouth like a muffled scream. Where is your justice? Where is your mercy? But the desert did not respond. Only the wind moved, dragging sand particles across the ground. He looked up at the sky, trying to find an answer, some light, but the horizon was empty. There was nothing. Habakkuk lay down on the sand, closing his eyes. The weight of his mission seemed to have become unbearable. The man who had once been full of conviction and fire now found himself reduced to a shadow of himself. Solitude was his only companion. He wondered once again if he had truly been chosen by God for this task. He wondered if he was merely following an illusory path, a path of suffering and pain without purpose. But as he gave himself up to the emptiness of his thoughts, something began to form within him, a strange sensation, like a pressure on his chest. He didn't know what it was, but it was as if an invisible force were trying to communicate something. He stood up, confused, his senses sharpened. The silence of the desert, once so oppressive, now seemed to carry tension. The wind, which had once seemed different, now seemed to whisper words he could not understand, and deep within his soul something began to awaken. Suddenly, a soft but commanding voice echoed in his mind, clear as a river cutting through the darkness. It was a voice he knew well, a voice he never imagined he would hear again. It was the voice of God. Habakkuk, the voice said, breaking the silence, cutting through the darkness. You are lost because you have not understood the purpose of your mission. You see yourself as a lone man, but in truth you are part of a greater plan, a plan that is not limited to what the eyes can see. The prophet immediately stood up, his breath quickening. He looked around, but saw no one. The desert was still there, vast and relentless, but something had changed. The air seemed denser, more filled with a presence that he didn't know whether to desire or fear. But Lord, he said, his voice trembling, what did I do wrong? What more can I do? The cities are destroyed, the temple desecrated, the people scattered, and those who remain are betraying one another. I no longer see the way to salvation. I have failed. The voice did not respond immediately. There was a moment of silence, and Habakkuk felt the weight of solitude return, as if the answer would never come. But then the voice spoke again with a clarity that pierced his heart. You have not failed, Habakkuk. You have been a voice that spoke the truth even when it was hard to hear. You did not see the end, and perhaps you never will, but my work does not end in human eyes. What you proclaimed was not in vain. The judgment was necessary, but redemption will also come. What is to come is a new beginning, something you cannot comprehend now, but be assured what you did was part of my plan. Habakkuk knelt, the pain and confusion still overwhelming him, but also a spark of hope kindling in his chest. He didn't know what the future held, but the presence of God there in that moment brought him an inexplicable relief. He was not alone. His mission had not been in vain. The future was in God hands, and he just needed to trust. Even in the darkness, when Habakkuk looked at the horizon, he saw a dark cloud forming in the sky, like a storm about to unleash. Something was coming, something big, but what? And what would this mean for the future of Judah and his own mission? The desert, now vast and silent like never before, seemed to reflect the emptiness that Habakkuk felt in his heart. God's voice had spoken as clear as the sound of distant thunder, but the peace he had hoped for had not settled. Instead, a deep turmoil formed within his spirit. The words he had heard kept echoing in his mind, but there was something he could not stop questioning. God's judgment on Judah was clear, but what about Babylon, the empire that destroyed his people? They aided the temple and crushed their hopes. When would justice be done for them? He was exhausted not only in body but in soul. The hot desert wind blew against his face as he rose again, walking aimlessly, but with his mind in a frenzy. Each step took him further from the ruined city, but also closer to an internal conflict. He could not resolve. He wanted to trust in God's words, but how could he when the cruelty of the Babylonians seemed endless, and divine justice still felt distant, a horizon that never arrived? Lord, where is the punishment for the Babylonians? Habakkuk shouted to the sky, his voice broken with frustration. Where is the justice for those who destroyed everything we love? Where is your mighty hand to strike down the oppressors? The sky remained silent for a long time. The earth, still warm beneath his feet, seemed to swallow his words, and the wind that blew seemed to mock his doubts. The impatience that had settled in his chest was growing in proportions he hadn't imagined. He had been patient, waiting for God's timing, believing that divine justice would come in due time. But the longer he waited, the more the sense that this justice would never come intensified. He felt the weight of each passing day, each day that Babylon continued to prosper while his people, Judah, were destroyed. Then once again God's voice was heard, clearer and more powerful than before. It was no longer a soft whisper, but a deep sound like thunder before a storm. Habakkuk, the voice said, you have been faithful in your words, and your pain is just, but you still do not understand the depth of my justice. The Babylonians who have fed on oppression and cruelty will also be judged. The punishment they deserve will come, but not in your time, and not in the way you imagine. The prophet lifted his head, feeling a mixed sensation of relief and frustration. God was speaking again, but the words did not bring the clarity he so desired. Instead of finding comfort, he felt even further from understanding what was to come. When, Lord, he asked, impatience clearly showing in his voice, when will the judgment come upon Babylon? What more needs to happen? Judah's suffering is unbearable. The people who know the truth and refuse to see it are being destroyed, and yet Babylon, with all its cruelty and pride, remains standing. God as always responded with patience, but there was a firmness in his voice that made it clear that the lesson had not yet been completed. I see the pride of Babylon, he said. They consider themselves invincible, believing that their strength and power are absolute. They feed on the destruction of others like hungry lions, but know, Habakkuk, that pride goes before a fall. Babylon in its arrogance thinks its empire is eternal, but my justice is coming, and it will be relentless. Habakkuk felt a chill run down his spine. The pride of Babylon, like a flame about to consume everything in its path, seemed to take form before him. He could picture the Babylonians with their hay faces and hardened hearts, believing they were beyond divine action, that they were free from any consequence. But God in his sovereignty had declared that their time would also come, yet the sense of distance still lingered. But Lord, Habakkuk tried again, his voice almost pleading, how much longer? Why do you make us wait? The pain is unbearable, and the Babylonians are in their glory with no sign of their fall. What more needs to happen? How can we endure more anguish, knowing that our justice is in your hands, but still distant? God's answer was more enigmatic, yet full of authority. My time is not the time of men, Habakkuk, he said. You see only what is before your eyes, and what you see is pain and destruction. But men like Babylon will only understand the true depth of what is just when they are faced with their own fall. They will be consumed by what they have become: arrogance, corruption, and cruelty. I will judge them at the moment it is necessary, and when that moment comes, no one will escape, even the proud, even those who think nothing can touch them. God's words seemed to fill the air, but Hawk's frustration did not lessen. He still couldn't see what was coming. He couldn't comprehend how divine justice could be delayed for so long, allowing Babylon to continue its destructive march while Judah, God's people, said goodbye to their dignity and hope. I am the Lord. God's voice continued, and my justice is perfect. Even when time seems to drag and suffering seems endless, know that nothing escapes my control. The fall of Babylon will come, and it will be greater than anyone could imagine. Habakkuk felt a new weight on his shoulders, but also a strange sense that something was changing. God's words were deep, but the prophet knew the path he was walking was still long. The patience and faith that God required seemed harder to maintain. With each passing moment, and at the same time, something more was being revealed, that suffering, no matter how immense, was part of something greater, something he still didn't fully understand. As Habakkuk reflected on God's words, a shadow stretched across the horizon, a sandstorm forming in the sky. But it was not a natural storm, it was something else, something the desert itself seemed to announce something was about to happen, and the prophet felt that. The answer was closer than he imagined, but what would that answer be, and would he be ready to receive it? The sandstorm was forming before Habakkuk, no longer as a tangible threat, but as a reflection of the internal storms that tormented him. The wind howled fiercely, but the desert seemed almost still, as if the world around him waited with the same fear that the prophet felt in his heart. He crouched down, trying to find shelter among the dunes, but his spirit did not calm. With each passing day, he felt the weight of suffering grow heavier, and the persistent question continued to hammer at his mind. When would justice come? When would Babylon fall? When would the suffering of his people come to an end? It was then that in the midst of the desert's darkness and the emptiness of his soul, something extraordinary happened. The voice of God was heard again, this time not gently or enigmatically, but with a definitive clarity, like thunder cutting through the night. Habakkuk, you are weary and your patience is running out, but I bring you a vision, something you must see, something that will give you understanding and hope for what is to come. Habakkuk lifted his head, feeling his breath quicken. He knew that something grand was about to happen, something beyond everything he had ever experienced, something that could finally answer his doubts and ease the pain in his soul. The vision formed before his eyes, not a common vision, but one that seemed to involve his entire being. He saw the future not as men would see it, but as God saw it. It was as if an invisible screen had been stretched before him, and on it unfolded the history of nations, the destiny of empires, the fall of all those who rose with arrogance and oppression. He saw Babylon with its grandeur and pride rising like an insurmountable tower, but as he looked, Habakkuk realized that at its top the tower began to crumble, pieces of stone disintegrating in the air. The empire that seemed invincible was being corroded, its foundation already compromised, like a giant with feet of clay. And around great Babylon, other nations rose and fell. Assyria, Egypt, Persia, Rome, all of them with their corruption, their sins, their cruelties, seemed to share a common fate. For each of them, judgment awaited. Habakkuk saw the justice of God descending like a storm, like fire that purifies, like water that extinguishes a flame. The destruction was immense, but it was not without reason. It was the cost of arrogance, cruelty, and the exploitation of the weak. But then the vision changed. The darkness surrounding the great nations dissipated for a moment, and Habakkuk saw something he had never imagined. He saw a new future, a new land, something pure, something that blossomed from the ashes. He saw a people small but faithful restored, and over them the hand of God was extended in mercy. Do you see, Habakkuk? The voice of God spoke again. All the nations that corrupt themselves with sin will meet their end, but my purpose goes beyond what human eyes can comprehend. End the suffering you witness now. The pain of your people is not the end. Judgment is necessary, but my mercy will be revealed in due time. Habakkuk stood still, absorbing the words, absorbing the vision unfolding before him. The grandeur of God was being revealed, not only in his judgment upon the wicked, but also in the promise of a redemptive future where, after the purification, true justice and peace would flourish. The prophet felt something awaken within him, something he had not felt in a long time. Hope. It was a spark of flame, but enough to light a fire. In his heart he understood then that suffering was not in vain, that every suffering, every loss had a purpose, and that true redemption was not only in the destruction of Babylon, but in the restoration of God's people, in the renewal of all creation. But this vision was not to be forgotten. Habakkuk knew he needed to write, he needed to record what he had seen, so that no one at any time would lose sight of the divine purpose. Behind every tear, every pain, he searched for stones and tablets, something on which to write. The vision he had received, the hand of God guided him, giving him the exact words, the details he needed to describe the vision clearly so that all who read it could understand. He knew this message must be shared, that the hope he felt should reach those who, like him, were on the brink of despair. The tablets filled with words of judgment, but also of promises of restoration, words that would remind anyone who read them that suffering was not the end, but a part of something greater. Write, Habakkuk, the voice said. Again, write, so that all may see the judgment of Babylon will come, but do not forget my justice will be fulfilled, and after the destruction there will be a new land, a new era of peace. When Habakkuk finished, he looked at the tablets now resting before him. He felt he had fulfilled a mission, but at the same time he knew the suffering of his people was not yet over. The battle against Babylon continued, and he did not know how much longer he would have to endure before divine justice was finally fulfilled. But for the first time in a long while he felt a lightness. The weight of the future, which had once crushed him, now seemed more bearable. He knew that his vision, God's vision, was not an immediate promise, but a certainty that in the end Justice would prevail. As the prophet looked at the tablets recording the future, the desert wind whispered unsettlingly something was approaching, something he could not foresee, and suddenly a distant cry cut through the silence, making him turn his head, his eyes widening as he saw a mysterious figure approaching from the horizon. Who was that shadow coming toward his solitude, and what would it bring with it? The desert, which had been the stage for Habakkuk's deepest solitude, now seemed distant. The tablets with the divine vision were carefully stored, but their weight still lingered. As the prophet left the vastness of the desert, he felt that something within him had changed. The suffering that once seemed meaningless was now intertwined with the promise of a better future. Even though it was distant, he knew that God's justice, though difficult to understand at the moment, would come, and with it renewal. But what was he to do with this vision? How could he bring hope to a people who had already been devastated, whose spirits seemed as broken as the ruins of Judah? With a heavy heart, yet renewed by the divine vision, Habakkuk began his journey back. He knew he had to return to his people, share the message that God had given him, even if it was hard for him to fully believe in the words. The journey seemed endless, the dry and barren landscapes reflecting his own inner anguish. But as he neared the ruined cities, something changed in his spirit. He felt that the people needed to hear his words. They needed a glimpse of hope. When he finally arrived at a small village, the scenes that unfolded before his eyes were like a reflection of the devastation he had witnessed in Jerusalem. There were few survivors, many of whom were wandering aimlessly, their eyes empty as if they had lost even the ability to mourn. The houses were in ruins, families were torn apart, and the air was heavy with despair. But amidst the rubble, Habakkuk noticed something that made him stop. Small groups of people, still with traces of strength in their eyes, were gathered. There were no tears, only the visible exhaustion of those who had been forced to survive, and yet there was something more in their hearts, something that could not be erased. Habakkuk approached cautiously. He could feel the distrust in their eyes, but also the desperate need to hear something other than the repetition of suffering. He knew he had no easy answers. There were no magic words that could heal the wounds of their land, but he had something that none of the survivors had at that moment: a vision of the future, the promise that suffering was not the end, that God's justice, though delayed, would come to pass. I know that many of you have lost everything, Habakkuk began, his voice soft but full of authority. I saw what happened. I saw the flames that devoured our land. I saw our brothers fall before the sword. I saw God's temple being desecrated, our city destroyed. But I also saw something else, something that, as painful as it is the truth. God's justice does not fail. Babylon, who destroyed us, will also be destroyed, not today, perhaps not tomorrow, but it will come, and with it restoration will come. The silence that followed was heavy. The people looked at him, trying to understand whether those words truly made sense, whether there was any truth in the promises he brought. Habakkuk inside was as uncertain as they were. He spoke with faith but also with doubt. The suffering they had all endured seemed so great, and the divine promise seemed so distant. I know many of you question, as I questioned, why God allowed this to happen. ABCA continued, his voice stronger now. Why the suffering? Why the tears? But the Lord revealed to me that suffering is part of a greater plan. It is not easy to understand. It is not something our human minds can fully grasp, but every tear, every pain we endure is part of the process, and in the end our faith will be rewarded. Restoration will come, and what was destroyed will be rebuilt. The words Habakkuk spoke, though said with all his heart, still seemed hard to believe. He saw in the people's eyes the internal struggle between hope and doubt, between faith and weariness. He felt the weight of responsibility and at the same time a sense of acceptance. Perhaps he would never fully understand why all the suffering, but he knew his mission was not to understand everything, but to convey what God had shown him. He did not have answers to all the questions, but he had something that many had lost: a vision of a future beyond destruction, beyond pain. I do not have all the answers, he said with humility, but what I saw was clear. What is gone is gone, what was lost is lost. But that does not mean we cannot rebuild. That does not mean God has abandoned us. He is not distant as many think. He is with us. Even when we cannot see, he is with us in pain, guiding us even in silence, and in the right time he will restore us. What happened next was something Habakkuk would never forget. A deep silence took over the group, but then a woman with hands marked by hard labor and a tired face stood up. Her eyes, once dull, now shone with a light that Habakkuk recognized. She said nothing, but her eyes were filled with gratitude, as if for the first time in a long time she had found something to hold on to,
something to believe in. And soon others began to approach, listening attentively, seeking in the prophet's words something to lift them from the mire they were in. Ark felt a peace fill his heart. He did not know what the future held, nor how the path ahead would unfold, but at that moment he knew his mission was clear: not to give answers, but to bring hope; not to understand all of God's plan, but to be a messenger of light even in the darkness. He slowly moved away, knowing there was no end to the journey. The tension was still present, the suffering was still great, but now there was something more. Faith, as small as it was beginning to be reborn. But as he walked back, he felt a strange presence behind him. Something was watching him. He quickly turned his eyes, scanning the shadows, but saw nothing, or perhaps he did not want to see what else awaited him on the road. And what did the feeling mean? That a new storm was about to form, one he could not avoid. The moon rose in the sky, its soft glow illuminating the ruins of Judah. The wind, which had once carried The heat of the desert now seemed to carry something more, an unsettling calm, as if the whole universe was waiting for something, waiting for the right moment. Habakkuk walked alone through the devastated land, his feet touching the ground with a lightness that contrasted with the weight he felt in his heart. The tablets he carried were now hidden, but God's vision still burned in his mind, a fire that could not be extinguished. In the days that followed his preaching, something had changed. The words he had brought began to spread slowly, like seeds scattered in the wind. Some people seemed to listen, and in their words and gestures there was a reflection of faith, but others, the majority, were still immersed in despair, skeptical of the possibility of redemption, of a better future to them. Habakkuk's promises were just empty dreams, words spoken by a man who did not understand real suffering, who had never lost everything, but something was beginning to grow inside the prophet. He felt a transformation taking place within him, as if the fire of the vision God had given in him was shaping his soul, burning the doubts and forging a stronger, deeper faith. Habakkuk was no longer the man who had arrived in the desert. The weight of his mission, of his doubt, had given way to something new. He had understood that he did not have all the answers, that God owed him no explanations. The prophet now understood that faith did not depend on answers, but on trust in God's character, even in silence, even in despair. It was then that on a quiet night, while the cool desert breeze caressed his face, Habakkuk sat on a solitary rock, his eyes fixed on the stars. He felt that it was the moment. The pain he had carried for so long, the doubt that had eaten at him, now had a purpose. He took a deep breath, closed his eyes, and began to sing, as if his voice were the only thing that could still touch the sky. The song emerged like a sigh from the soul, and its words echoed in the silence of the night. They did not speak of easy answers or an immediate future. They did not speak of the destruction that still surrounded him, nor of the scars of war. No, Habakkuk's song was a cry of trust in God, even in despair, even in loss. Though the fig tree does not blossom and the vine does not bear fruit, though the olive trees fail and the field does not produce food, still I will rejoice in the Lord. I will exult in the God of my salvation. The words came out with a strength he did not know he had. He sang with an unwavering conviction, as if it were the only thing that could give meaning to all the destruction around him. He knew that the people, those who listened to him, needed to hear this. They needed to understand that even if everything were taken away, there was still something, that no one could take hope in God. But Lord, my God is my strength. He makes me walk on high places. He clothes me with strength and courage, and leads me in the way of salvation. With each word, with each note, Habakkuk felt a transformation within himself. He was no longer the prophet who questioned God, who cried out for answers. Now he was a man who understood that true faith is not based on what is seen, but on what is believed, and he believed in God. He believed that in the end the promise of redemption would be fulfilled. Not at that moment perhaps, but someday, somewhere, peace and restoration would come. When the song ended, Habakkuk remained silent. He felt lighter, as if a burden had been lifted from his shoulders. He knew that although the battle was not over, he had taken the first step in accepting the role God had given him. He did not have all the answers, but he had something more precious, a renewed faith. The next day he shared his song with the people. Some, as he acted, looked on with skepticism. Their eyes were filled with distrust, as if they could not believe the words coming out of his mouth. But there were others, few, who heard Habakkuk's words with a glimmer of hope. In their eyes they did not fully understand, but they felt something new in their hearts. It was a small flame, but enough to rekindle the dormant faith within them. Habakkuk continued to walk among them, sharing his vision, singing his song of hope. But there were still many who remained skeptical, many who could not detach themselves from the suffering, the pain they had lived through. The transformation would not be quick, it would not be easy, but he now knew that his mission was not to force change, but to plant the seeds of hope and let God water them in his own time. As the prophet walked with his mission now clearer in his mind, he realized that his own transformation was still underway. He was no longer the man who doubted, who questioned God's justice. Now he was someone who trusted fully, even in the darkness, even in the pain. He knew that true faith was not based on certainties, but on the unwavering trust in God, who, even in the darkest of nights, never abandons his children. But while Habakkuk sang and spread hope, a shadow was forming on the horizon. Something big, something terrible was approaching. The wind carried with it the distant sound of a battle, and the prophet's eyes narrowed. Peace seemed to be in sight, but how far? War, destruction, everything could return in an even more relentless way. What was the future still preparing for those who dared to believe in redemption? The wind blows cold through the ruins of Judah, hissing between the debris of houses and temples. The horizon, which once seemed promising, now stretches empty like a canvas, without colors, without life. Babylon, with its unbeatable strength, continues its relentless march, and nothing seems capable of stopping the advance of what seemed to be the final destruction. The world in Habakkuk's eyes no longer held the contours of hope that he had once imagined, the vision he received, the promise of restoration now seemed to dissipate. Like mist at dawn, the prophet walked through the
devastated land, his hands clenched into fists, his eyes fixed on the dry ground. What he felt was not only sadness, not just the loss of what had once been his home. It was doubt, a dark hole in the depths of his soul that seemed to swallow all light he had heard. God's promises, he had seen the vision of redemption, but what was happening now seemed to contradict all of that. Babylon was stronger than ever, its invincible troops and its cities growing like open wounds in the earth. The empire was expanding fearlessly, mercilessly, like a shadow that swallowed everything in its path. Lord, where are you? Habakkuk murmured to the wind, his voice trembling, almost broken. Doubt consumed him. The belief that had once ignited his soul now seemed to be extinguishing in the face of cruel reality. He wondered as he never had before, had God forgotten the promise of justice? Had he forgotten us? He looked to the sky but saw nothing. Only the stars, distant and indifferent, seemed to watch his suffering. The prayer that had once come naturally now seemed like a cry lost in the void. Where was the justice? Where was God's intervention? What was happening to the righteous while the empires of evil rose unchecked, destroying everything they touched? Where was the divine answer to the pain and suffering that had dragged on for so long? Little by little, the words of God that he had once known by heart began to seem vague, like echoes from a distant time. Habakkuk wondered if what he had heard was in fact the truth, or if it had all been an illusion, a vision given to soothe his soul and his mission. But now, in the face of the reality of destruction and the unstoppable rise of Babylon, he felt the weight of despair. How could one believe in promises of redemption when the forces of evil dominate the world so absolutely? However, there was still something inside him, a fragile voice, but still present something that urged him to continue. He felt that doubt was a test that true faith did not show itself in comfort, but in the moment of greatest anguish, and still the feeling of abandonment was growing. He wanted to feel that his mission had a purpose, that his struggles still held value, but what he saw around him offered no answers, only more ruins, more lives destroyed, more endless suffering. He returned to the village where days before he had found the survivors. Now the streets were even quieter, desolation taking over everything. But something made him stop. A man approached him, his eyes lowered, his shoulders slumped. He was one of those who had listened to his words with curiosity, with a glimmer of hope, but now what remained in that man was an empty, broken expression. "Prophet," the man said in a dragged voice, "I don't know what to think anymore. The promises you spoke, all of this seems so distant. Babylon doesn't stop and we continue to suffer day after day. How can we believe that there is redemption when all we see is destruction? How can we hope that a just God will save us when we see nothing but evil prevail?" Ailing, Habakkuk looked at the man, and the pain of his own doubt reflected in the man's eyes. He felt the same anguish, the same anguish. How could he give an answer? How could he give an answer? How could he continue preaching hope when he himself was so uncertain? "I know," Habakkuk began, his voice trembling. "I know what you feel. I doubt too sometimes. It seems like God is distant, like he has abandoned us. I have questioned, and still question, why this is happening. But even so, something inside me tells me that even amidst all this evil, God is still in control. I don't understand why all the suffering. I don't know the right time or the right way, but I know he is with us even when we can't see it." The words sounded empty to Habakkuk, as if he was trying to convince himself just as much as the man in front of him. The doubt was taking root deeper, and in his heart he felt the battle between faith and despair growing. "With each passing moment, I know it's hard," he continued, trying to convey confidence, "but even if Babylon continues its rise, even if destruction surrounds us, the Lord still has a plan. He has not forgotten us, even though it may seem like he has. He knows what he's doing even when we don't understand, and there is a right time for justice to come." But his words, though the same he had repeated so many times, no longer seemed to carry the same power. Doubt was spreading between them like an invisible disease. Habakkuk felt that deep down he was as lost as everyone else. Suddenly the wind rose again, stronger, carrying a dark cloud on the horizon. The sound of the storm in the distance seemed like a warning, as if the very sky was about to collapse onto the earth. Habakkuk looked to the sky, his heart tight, his breath held. What more was coming? What more could happen before the promise of justice was fulfilled? And then, like a harbinger of something imminent, a distant cry cut through the silence of the night. It was not the sound of war, but something darker, something deeper. Habakkuk turned quickly, his eyes fixed on the darkness. What did that cry mean, and what was about to happen? Something that could finally break the spiral of destruction that seemed endless. The scream that echoed through the night seemed to be the prelude to something darker, something about to unfold before Habakkuk's eyes. The wind, now stronger and charged with tension, pushed away the heavy clouds that had when covering the horizon. He looked into the darkness, feeling deep in his heart that something was about to change. The same heart that once tightened with doubt now beat harder, as if it were the beginning of a revelation, an end he could not foresee but was already beginning to take shape before him. The prophet felt a stronger presence in the air, as if God himself were about to intervene. The stillness of the night was broken by a distant murmur, a movement he could not comprehend but somehow knew was not merely an omen. It was a sign that something great was happening. Habakkuk climbed the hill where so many times before he had sat to contemplate the destruction around him, but now he felt that the wind carried something different, no longer the breath of tragedy, but the echo of change. And then, with his gaze fixed on the stars, he saw a star brighter Then the others blinked in the sky, and in that moment the prophet felt something profound within him. It was as if God himself were pointing to that moment. The vision was clear. Babylon the Great and imposing Babylon, which seemed invincible, was now being consumed from within. The pride and corruption that had sustained its empire were beginning to disintegrate like clay under the pressure of time. The cycle of oppression that seemed endless, which had destroyed lives, torn hopes, and shaken the spirit of the people of Judah, was now beginning to break. Habakkuk saw in his vision how the walls of Babylon, which had risen so high and secure, were beginning to crack, not because of an external enemy but because of the internal rot that was consuming its foundations. The Babylonian kings, with hearts hardened by greed and power, were now being undermined by the corruption they themselves had nurtured. The empire that once seemed invincible was crumbling from within, corroded by decay and betrayal, a betrayal they had committed not only against others but against themselves. The people of Babylon, submissive and fearful, were beginning to see what many had already noticed but dared not admit. The pride that had sustained the empire was a lie, and now the lie was being revealed. Habakkuk saw Babylonian leaders, once so confident and relentless, now being consumed by doubt and distrust. What had once been impenetrable was becoming vulnerable. The vanity and corruption that had fueled their rise were now fueling their fall. The prophet quickly descended from the hill, his words failing to reach his mind. He felt a mixture of disbelief and relief. What he had waited for, the fulfillment of the divine promise, was finally beginning to happen. But there was something dark in the air, something he could not fully understand. Justice was being fulfilled, but the price still seemed so high. As he walked through the ruins, he came upon a group of survivors. They were gathered around a campfire, speaking softly, their eyes heavy with exhaustion. When they saw him, they fell silent. Habakkuk sat among them, and before he could say anything, one of the men stood up. "Prophet," he said, his voice tense, "what are you feeling? Do you feel this Babylon is beginning to fall? I've heard rumors the Babylonian king is lost, the crown is in ruins, and the empire that destroyed us now begins to turn on itself." Habakkuk looked at the man, and for a moment uncertainty washed over him. He didn't know what to say, but he didn't need to explain anymore. He knew what he had seen. He knew that God's justice was beginning to be fulfilled, and that no matter how long it took, truth and justice would always prevail in the end. "Yes," Habakkuk replied, his voice firmer than he thought himself capable of. "It is beginning. Babylon, which seemed invincible, is now disintegrating. God's justice does not fail, even if it takes time, even if the suffering is immense. God will fulfill his word. Babylon will fall because of its own arrogance." The man looked at him with a mixture of hope and doubt. There was a glimmer in the eyes of the people of around, a faint but real glow, as if at last the darkness was beginning to dissipate. The fall of Babylon was still distant, but now its first signs of decay were visible, no longer as a city surrounded by an external enemy, but as a structure rotting from within, about to collapse. Habakkuk felt the weight he had carried for so long beginning to lift. But not in a simple way. The path of justice, even when fulfilled, was not easy. He knew that the fall of Babylon would not mean the end of suffering. The struggle would continue, but something was changing, something profound, something undeniable was happening. God was fulfilling his promise, and the justice which had seemed so distant was finally beginning to be revealed. He stood up, looking at the horizon. The Babylonian empire was still standing, but its foundations were beginning to crack. Habakkuk felt God's presence beside him, not in thunder or grand vision, but in the quiet certainty that justice would be done. Redemption was beginning, but the cycle of suffering had not yet ended. The future was still uncertain, but now he knew that God had never abandoned him, and no matter how twisted the path, divine justice was finally beginning to be fulfilled. But as the prophet watched the fall of Babylon unfold before him, a new threat appeared on the horizon, not from a distant empire but from within his own people. Something darker, more treacherous, was about to be revealed, testing Habs and the people's true faith. What more would the future bring, and what would be the final cost of the redemption that was beginning to be fulfilled? The wind, which had once carried the signs of Babylon's fall, now seemed gentler, as if it were announcing the end of an era and the beginning of something new. Habakkuk was alone on a distant hill, watching the horizon where the last trace of the night began to fade, making way for the first light of morning. His mind was heavy with revelations he had experienced in the past days, and his heart beat with a mix of relief and uncertainty. He had witnessed suffering, destruction, divine punishment, and redemption. He had seen God's promises being fulfilled before his eyes, the fall of Babylon, the disintegration of a corrupted empire. But as events unfolded, he began to perceive something deeper, something beyond visible justice, beyond vengeance upon the oppressors, something he had not understood until that moment. The prophet sat down, crossing his legs, gazing at the now clear and vast sky. Felt the weight of all his questions, his internal struggles. All along he had been expecting a direct answer from God, a clear sign of his presence, a miraculous intervention that would reaffirm divine justice, something tangible to silence all his doubts. But now, amid the silence, a new truth began to unfold before him. Was I wrong? Habakkuk whispered to himself, his voice breaking the silence. Did I search too much for signs, for answers that could justify the pain, the destruction, and the faith that seemed to dissipate before our helplessness? Perhaps the true test was not the suffering of the people, but my own faith, the faith that demands proof, that demands a visible justification. He looked around, observing the ruins of the cities, the scars still marking the land, There were survivors, but the pain remained, yet something within him had changed. What had he learned in those days of suffering and uncertainty? That true faith, the faith that pleases God, is not based on seeing or understanding signs. It is deeper than that. It is believing, trusting, even when God's silence seems endless, even when there are no clear answers to the world's torments. That's it, he murmured, feeling peace begin to infiltrate his heart. God's true secret is not in his punishments or his rewards. It's not in Babylon or Judah. It's in trusting in God's silence. It's trusting in him, not because we see, but because we know he is with us, even in the emptiness of absence. Habakkuk closed his eyes and let the wind caress his face, feeling God's presence in a way he could no longer explain with words. He no longer needed more proof. He no longer needed more signs. The true test of faith was not observing justice done, but fully trusting in God, even when the world around seemed lost and meaningless at that moment. A profound serenity flooded his soul. He understood that God did not have to justify his actions to anyone, that his sovereignty did not need to be questioned or explained. He finally realized that faith was not about seeing, but about believing without seeing, about walking without fully understanding the steps. It was trusting even when the answer did not come. It was resting in God's silence and knowing that he was in control even when everything seemed out of control. He stood up, feeling the weight of years of struggle and questioning dissipating, not because answers had been given, but because he had found a deeper peace, a peace that did not depend on what was happening around him, but on the unshakable trust that God was and always would be present. Redemption was not just about a people or a nation. Redemption, in fact, was in the trust that God knew what he was doing even when he seemed absent. Habakkuk smiled for the first time in a long while, not out of relief, but out of understanding. He had finally comprehended the hidden secret that God had kept from him all that time. True faith is the one that doesn't demand proof, that doesn't require answers, that doesn't seek understanding. It is a pure trust, one that goes beyond vision, beyond words, beyond pain and doubt. As he turned to walk back to the people, his steps were firmer. He no longer had all the answers, but he knew he didn't need them. He had found true freedom, true peace. He now knew that divine justice was not just about the fall of the oppressors, but about the absolute trust in God, even in the silence. God's secret, the secret he had searched for so long, was simple trust without seeing. He finally understood. But as Habakkuk walked toward the people with the weight of the revelation still fresh in his soul, a new sound reached his ears, a familiar and terrifying sound, like the echo of distant thunder or the roar of a growing horse. Something new was about to emerge, something that would test Habakkuk's faith even further. What would this new threat be, and how would the prophet react to the final trial of his journey? The story of Habakkuk is a profound testimony of faith, resilience, and spiritual transformation. Throughout his journey, the prophet not only faced the horrors of the destruction that ravaged his people, but also struggled with his own internal questions, doubts, and fears. The suffering of Judah and the apparent absence of God led him to a point of despair, but it also propelled him on a journey of self-discovery and divine revelation. What we learn from the story of Habakkuk is that true faith is not defined by the absence of suffering or by a complete understanding of the events around us. On the contrary, faith is about trusting in God even when we don't understand his plan or see the immediate fruits of his promises. The prophet learned that suffering, although painful and bewildering, has a divine purpose, even when he cannot not see it clearly at the moment. Each moment of doubt, each tear shed, became seeds for a deeper understanding of God's nature and the faith he requires. Habakkuk's internal struggle, his doubt, his anguish, and his search for answers reflects human fragility in the face of suffering. However, his spiritual transformation led him to realize that true faith is not based on visible signs or the immediate resolution of all problems. Instead, faith is trusting in God in the silence, when chaos seems to reign and when justice seems to reign, and when justice seems distant. Habakkuk's final revelation is that the true test of faith is not seeing justice unfold, but fully trusting in God even in absolute violence. The deepest lesson Habakkuk offers us is about unrestrained trust in God, which goes beyond understanding or explanation. When the prophet finally understood that the true strength of faith lies in believing without needing proof, he freed himself from the chains of doubt and surrendered to the divine silence, accepting that God in his time and his way always fulfills his promises. The suffering of Judah, the betrayals, the losses, and even the fall of Babylon, all of this is part of a great divine plan. In the end, Habakkuk discovered that faith is not about getting answers to all questions, but about surrendering to the unknown. Trusting that even when we do not see, God is in control. He accepted that the true miracle was not the fall of the oppressors, but the internal transformation that happens within each of us when we learn to trust without seeing. Ultimately, the story of Habakkuk teaches us that true faith is not based on immediately understanding suffering or God's justice, but on trusting in him even when suffering seems endless and answers do not come. The prophet's journey, marked by anguish, doubt, and profound transformation, serves as a reminder that with faith and patience we can find peace in the midst of the storm and witness redemption, not through victory over enemies, but in trusting that God has a greater plan for each of us. The story of Habakkuk does not end with the fall of Babylon, but with the true understanding of what it means to trust in God, a deep realization that in the silence God is working, in suffering he is with us, and in faith he guides us to the final redemption. If you enjoyed this story, 2 other similar biblical story videos will appear on your screen. Click to watch, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave your like. May God be with you.